Welcome to today's episode of Coffee with Chris. Today's guest is Chuck Brooks. He is an executive with extensive service in the senior executive management, government relations, business development, marketing, sales, branding, digital engagement, and communications, as well as a technology evangelist. I always see him as a top 1% viewed on my list for LinkedIn, and I think he probably follows that at least with most of us. So I'm welcoming Chuck Brooks now to our talk, and we wanted to talk a little bit about cybersecurity today, and both of us have a background from a very different angle. But welcome to the show today, Chuck. How are you?
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate being on it. I'm doing great.
So I would like to hear from you what your area of expertise is and how you work in Washington, D.C. there, all the connections you have and things that you do. Just give us a background for Chuck Brooks.
Okay, well, I'll start out. I'm a Midwesterner, actually. I came from Chicago area. It's a good year to be from Chicago with the Cubs, too. So, but I went to school at DePaul in Indiana, a small school in Greencastle, Indiana, in the middle of nowhere, in farm country. And then when it came to the University of Chicago, where I studied international relations. And I came to Washington, like most other people here, thinking they'll do maybe a year of an internship or do something and go back and find a career back where you live. But I ended up staying. So I've been in Washington, D.C. for pretty much most of my professional life. And I've worked in a variety of areas, starting out when I first came here is at the Voice of America, working for the director of it, Richard Carlson, and turning into a speechwriter and an intergovernment relations person there. An exciting time right during the Cold War. And then I went to work for almost 8 years on the Hill for the late Arlen Specter, a senator from Pennsylvania, where I handled a variety of issues, including defense, foreign affairs, technology, business, Native American rights, all kinds of things. So it was a real learning experience. And then after that, I'd started my own business, but I got called to work on a big startup that was called the Department of Homeland Security. And I was one of the first people that worked with the team that Governor Tom Ridge assembled, and I helped set up the legislative affairs shop. And then directly after that was done, I went to work at the only really new part of the Department of Homeland Security, called the Science and Technology Directorate, where I work with the best and the brightest on all kinds of threats, from biological to nuclear, and a little bit back then in cybersecurity, but not as much as now as its focus. But so I spent almost 5 years there before I came back to the corporate sector where I am now. And I'm working as a vice president for marketing and government relations for Sutherland Government Solutions. And I sit on a bunch of boards, including being a technology advisor to the Bill Gates Foundation, eCrypt Board of Directors, and Franklin Foundation for Innovation, educational technology group, and several others. So that's a quick recap of my career.
Wow, that is very quick, but taking things back a notch here. And we had talked a little bit before we got on here about kind of my experience from an industrial control side in cybersecurity, and how there's kind of a divide when it comes to industrial controls. For the first 15 years of my career, I worked on electronic design, so PLCs and things that talked in factories. And I was saying that it wasn't until 6 or 7 years ago that I crossed with InfoSec, information security, and it came to light. And I said, "Wow, what is this?" Because I have worked with machine-to-machine communications for now the better part of my life, and everything I'm hearing about cybersecurity is about securing information, which in machine-to-machine communications we don't even really care about. Information. There's no storage of data. Data is about commands from one device to another. So I'm curious to kind of contrast that with you, and what are your thoughts about that divide? Give us an understanding of your direction and what you think when we talk about cybersecurity. What does that mean to you and the bigger part of the people you're involved with?
Sure. I mean, cybersecurity is such an encompassing area. It really is very, very broad. And I guess you have to start with the public-private part of it. The private sector owns most of the infrastructure which you worked on, including most of our transportation, our nuclear plants, communications, financial, etc. Yet the government, is responsible for protecting a lot of it and regulating it. So there becomes a immediate divide right there. And then you have the issue of course, privacy and competitiveness among a lot of the companies that sell to the government and want to do activities with the government and not have their secrets taken by other companies. So you have a mess to begin with. But what has happened, cybersecurity 15 years ago, right, it was more of a military solution, compartmentalized. There was not, that started out, there was the DARPA nets and other things, but now it's become so I guess overwhelming, since everyone and anyone is now connected and continually connected, and everything and every device now is connected. So the how you protect it and what kind of regulations and what kind of format you use and where you go is just continually evolving, as there's really no set of international standards and rules that are adhered to by everybody or countries. And then you have the other issue, of course, that a lot of the problems with the cybersecurity are aimed at state actors trying to steal secrets, whether they be commercial secrets or actually, in the case of OPM, stealing identities and information of classified workers. So there's a lot of elements to protect. So when I say cybersecurity, it is everything, and it's going to be more of everything in the next coming years.
There's privacy and security. Do you view them as kind of the same thing?
No, I mean, I don't, particularly from a DHS background point of view, because there's some elements that as a government or someone you're protecting, you have to sometimes forego some of the privacy issues. You do that when you swear in to work for the government. You're giving up a lot of information, who you talk to, where you go, if you hold a security clearance. So there's our elements of responsibility where your privacy is sort of sacrificed, and that is in a national security area primarily. If you're dealing with threats to our very sovereignty, and now a lot of people think cybersecurity could be basically turn off all the grid and destroy all kinds of things. There's a lot of possibilities, but so I think that is an element. But now you look also the whole system of American government, particularly, is based on the right of the individual, the right of privacy, the government non-interference, and then because cyber has become so much of our part of our lives, or rather just information exchange part of our lives, that everything we do and operate, in our smartphones and our computers, it's more so. My little daughters are started using cell phones when they're smartphones when they're 5-6 years old, and that's the new generation. So it's going to be difficult to really put a line on where you balance privacy and security in most of your activities, because there's also issues with safety, public safety. There's issues with bullying. There's all kinds of issues. So again, it goes back to the idea that cybersecurity is so big and so many aspects that it's hard to narrow it down into two sort of concrete elements, but rather, just I guess by experience or specific area is the only way you can really deal with it.
Yeah. So if we step back now, I asked about security and privacy because I see privacy as so data-centric. And then if you step over to the Internet of Things, the development that we're looking at in the future, where everything that communicates, everything that's electronic becomes on a grid communicating. And those things communicate without people involved. So if you step back and say, okay, privacy is the aspect of people with security and their data, what do we call, and I have some ideas on this, but if you step back to the Internet of Things and devices that are communicating without people, and we'll say there's 15 devices on poles out in the field somewhere, whether they're power grid, railroads, stoplights, traffic lights, do autos, if cars are going to be self-driving, things like that. Anything that's a computer that can talk, doesn't really interface with people as the primary aspect. Now you have a paradigm for security that doesn't really involve data as in terms of amounts of data that people interface with. The data becomes triggering of commands to do one thing or another. And if two machines are talking and one machine's saying, we'll use an example if it's a coffee pot. I've turned on the coffee. I've turned on the coffee. It really, these simple machines do the same thing millions of times. So
Right.
the only relevant data that they transfer is that they've turned on the coffee at 6 o'clock. So now we've related data to a time which has relevance to the human world. But if we step back and say, now what is important to these machines that communicate without people involved, if there's 20 of them on poles and they have to transfer a signal from one to the next, that becomes trusting that machine that there's no person there, and trusting that a machine sent them a command and they validate that command before they do something if things are going both ways. So now the paradigm changes from privacy and data to, do I trust all these machines that don't have people involved? What do you think about that?
No, and that is actually an element of almost getting back to the issue of artificial intelligence, because that's what Stephen Hawking just wrote about, that how can we trust the robots once we lose control? And a similar kind of thing with the Internet of Things. Do we lose control if we're not controlling the commands between all these devices? And the other aspect, of course, is, can these devices be infected with malware from bad actors? And the answer probably to both of them are yes. So you have an issue of trust that is always going to be endemic to everything dealing with information exchange. And so for talking about the toaster, the refrigerator, I think we're okay, because no one's going to really be interested in basically taking over those commands. But if you're talking about working on a laptop, it's already being done, where someone can take over the camera and your privacy. Or if you're driving a car, realistically, they'll know where you're driving, how fast you're going, what your patterns are. Mm-hmm. I mean, you're giving up such an element of privacy to these Internet of Things that you'll be monitored. You have sensors on you. Eventually, it becomes Big Brother of things if you're looking into the Orwellian viewpoint. So it is sort of scary in one side, and then it's sort of positive in another, that you'll be able to use a lot of these devices and communications to basically increase your lifespan, monitor your health, and make things easier to get to. But again, it comes back to trust. I mean, who's in charge? Yeah. If you have a bad government in charge, if you have a dictator in charge, or if you have a artificial intelligence in charge of you, I mean, you can't control the outcome. So it's a real interesting and fascinating area to think about. So we're thinking about that trust. I mean, it always seems to come back, and I heard you take it back to privacy and individuals' privacy, and that those data things are related to people. But in terms of, like I started out by saying, I worked for 15 years on machines that are out there communicating without people, that the data isn't about people. And those machines turn on and off things that are vital to our safety is a big thing. Yes. And they don't really, once again, we go back to, they don't care about data. They don't have data that they maintain. A lot of them don't even have data storage. They only have state. So you know what state the machine is in, and it changes from one state to the next. And that is what's relayed from one machine to another in communication-wise. So if we take and say that privacy is about the people aspect, trust is kind of on the other side of cybersecurity, about the machine-to-machine aspect. And that kind of goes into, if we get a piece of information from a machine that hasn't been touched by a human for 5 years, how do we know that that data came from that machine and didn't come from somebody on the other side of the world faking it to make it look like it was that machine? Yeah, and you're right, and that's probably where you need authentication controls and other aspects to look beyond the originator of that command. So that it becomes a new interesting area. And I'm sure a lot of the Cisco's and Intel's are looking into that because it is quite a new area. But you're right. I mean, it's not too difficult to envision machine-to-machine world in almost every aspect of that we do. We're doing it right now with our finances, and it could be quite vulnerable, and you could put yourself in a situation where your identity is basically compromised. Yeah. So now you're working in the government a lot, and you do a lot of those. How are the entities in the navigating Washington D.C.? You said very
I'd love to have your expertise in that area. What do you see that's, as far as these issues where we're coming up at looking at the Internet of Things and all these machine-to-machines, trust on one side of cybersecurity, privacy on the other side, how are we as a culture, as a society? You said you're sure that the Cisco's and Intels are interested in that. But do you think it's a problem, or it's something that one of those companies will solve? Or do you think it's something that we as a collective, from your government side, need to solve?
I think it's going to be go back to the public-private, it's going to be a combination. So I'd say collective, because there's so many interchanging aspects. And you talk about the Washington scene with regard to emerging technologies. It's sort of a nascent area here too. There's a lot of associations that are based here, a lot of privacy associations, technology, software, everything is in here. 6,000 associations in Washington. So it is sort of an epicenter for this. Plus, you have the DARPAs and the ARPAs and the SARPAs here at DHS, all focusing on sort of futuristic aspects of this. But one of the things I found about living out in Washington is that the amount of people share. So it's a real challenge to get people to work and collaborate together. And that's also a lesson I learned back when I was working at DHS with the labs. We have some amazing technology and talent in our national labs, which are truly assets to our country and to the world. But there's so much IP out there and so much knowledge that is not shared that, if we ever basically mined it, and brought it to the forefront and made it used for a public good, we could probably even be a more advancing civilization. There's just a lot out there. But in Washington, I think part of the challenge is first, getting people to understand things. What is it that it took years to get them to understand the threat of cybersecurity and discuss it. Now it's everywhere. Mm-hmm. Every conference, conference every day of the week in Washington, and now there's also in Congress. There's technology caucuses and there's cybersecurity caucuses, and so I think it comes to getting basically involving what I call all the pillars, which would be the media, particularly the new media and the media like this, the organizations and the legislators, and then finally the institutions themselves, into sort of communicating together and looking at these issues as a big picture and the challenges ahead of them.
So who do you see as the leader in this? Is there a leader? I mean, I'm looking at, is there something I can do as a voice? Because I feel like I've banged my head against the wall for so many years on this topic, trying to realize that it's bigger than any one company. It's bigger than any government because of the divide across everything. And cybersecurity really goes into everything that we'll do in the future. So bringing that awareness together, where does it start? And how can we start to pull this all together?
Yeah, I think it really is sort of a grassroots thing that's happening on social media. You see, some of the content I read on LinkedIn is sort of amazing. There's a lot of futurists out there, and you'll see people like Vint Cerf, father of the internet and an evangelist for Google, who's very out front on these issues and establishing a lot of dialogue on it. So I think it takes the sort of the individual leaders, particularly out of the sciences and the technology areas, to sort of speak about it, to guest lecture, to talk about it in universities, and to write about it on the internet. And then I think the second part is pushing the policy and the other people to testify, to get legislation put forth, and to work on it, sort of collectively. It's sort of a ground up exercise, I think, rather than a top down one. But yeah, it's amazing what's out there, and it's and you can go to LinkedIn or Twitter and find so much information from some of the top minds globally. It's amazing. But now it's sort of how to basically put it all together.
Yeah. So what kind of, if you saw, I haven't seen a real, we've talked earlier, I've been on several standards bodies efforts, we'll say going back to the mid-2000s. There's a lot of interest at first. A lot of people come in, and whenever it's funded by the government with a little bit of we'll say research and development money, the efforts take off. But then they kind of dry up, and it kind of goes then to the big companies, the Ciscos, the Microsofts, the Googles. And one thing that I kind of see repeatedly is that a lot of the bigger companies in the world drive the cybersecurity effort from the top down because they're interested in the big data picture, the big sales, the top end functionality. And you just said a couple minutes ago that it has to kind of come from the bottoms up. So when we're driving it by the big companies and governments, they're driving from the top down. Most people would say, like you did, it's got to come from the bottom up. How does that meet?
Well, that's a good question. Part of the problem that you mentioned earlier is the problem with R&D and government itself is that it's the first budget part sacrificed in sequestration and continuing resolutions, because for many years, government has not prioritized those kind of programs. So the private sector, by de facto, and for other motives too, for commercial and profit motives, has invested a lot more into the R&D areas, and frankly, they're better than the government is for the most part. And there's exceptions with some of the labs and with DARPA, and except that really do cutting edge. But so I think again, it is top down with companies because they're looking, at basically their strategic plan and where they're going to position themselves. But again, the swell, what I call it, the sort of information swell that comes from everywhere in the competition. It's not just the people, but it's also the universities, the MITs, Caltechs, Chicago's, others that are really generating a lot of IP, generating a lot of thought and thought leadership on these issues. So it's got to be, tactically the way to bring and it's what's happening is a way to bring sort of these companies and government together is to do conferences and to do joint white papers and other thing like that. And that's starting to happen. So that's sort of, I guess, the midpoint. But you're right about it really is coming down to, who has the money and where they want to spend it. And that's a top-down decision.
Well, and the top-down decision, this is just from my experience, maybe you can weigh in on this, comes down to the companies that have the biggest stake and we'll say have contributed the most monetary-wise in R&D are doing so with an interest in data. So their data analytics, internet traffic monitoring, I call boundary management, monitoring the boundaries between networks, between computers and networks, between companies, between organizations. And that's, your firewalls, your data sec. But if we go back to what I started saying at the beginning of my talk, I went for 15 years on the EE side, not caring about data. So if the whole approach from the tops down, from the biggest investment in R&D into cybersecurity is about data, and a whole half of the market doesn't care about data, how does that factor into a continued direction that works out?
Well, it's almost a yin-yang in a sense, but it's going to go again where the market dictates and where the you said analytics and data are basically, if you want to put it in a commercial sense, it's where the money is right now.
Yeah. So
that part's going to dominate, and then the rest of the other aspects are required activities, mostly by the government and infrastructure, are going to go about their ways. But a lot of them have not been able to modernize because of the resources are being put more into the data side.
Yeah.
And that's I guess the grid is a good example.
Does a solution work if we're only looking at the big data aspect in cybersecurity? Is it possible?
No, I think you need both. Certainly, it's a paramount that you look at the big data, but you have to look at everything holistically, and otherwise you're going to leave yourself with large vulnerabilities and gaps, and that has happened. And again, going back to the grid example of the failure of modernization of most of the basic technologies for the last 30 years has led to a lot of vulnerabilities, blackouts, and potentially natural events that could basically put us back in the Stone Age if we're not upgrading the equipment. So there's some definite an issue there.
Yeah, I'm pulling up something right now I wanted to read to you that really just kind of centered the reason I was asking this question. And I'll have to find it in my email here real second. Here. Okay, here it is. And this is from a rather large government organization. I'll try to leave names out.
Okay.
Currently, we're reaching out to utilities to see what is important for them to focus on. The problem our organization had in the past is that we had lots of ideas, consultants, but nothing grounded in realities of what utilities wanted or were willing to pay for in terms of membership. I hope to change this past view. We will not be successful as an organization if members don't value what we do and won't pay to join. So basically we'll say a large organization that has been the center of the research and development. And the conversation was about exactly what we're talking about, the data-centric, tops-down approach versus kind of a bottoms-up and pulling all the organization side of security together with a trust type of side. And but we've got to such a point that they're only reaching out for where the funding comes from big organizations, which is so data-centric focused that I don't see the rest of, any way that the solution can ever foster if you need both sides of this, if you're only looking at a data-centric approach.
No, you definitely, and again, I go back to that example of, you said the utilities are looking at the grid and the transformer vulnerabilities, and the reason they haven't upgraded them or allocated resources is because there hasn't been a demand to, despite the fact of the vulnerability. So part of the problem is you have to create a demand in an exchange of information. And utilities, I don't have as much experience as you do with working with them, but they're their own entity and their own governance. And despite the fact that there's been a lot of regulatory efforts over them by Congress and stuff like that, they'll do what they want to do.
Yeah.
And that's been an issue. I think Congressman Trent Franks has been pretty much a one-man gang on trying to oversee them, get them to spend money in areas where they need to spend money. But it's a, I guess if you want to call it if looking at an area that they have no competition, so there's no there's no motives.
I guess I'm just reaching for, what is, in my same kind of passion in this is, can we organize something that works from a societal point of view? And it might seem as an idealistic approach, but if we keep following only where big data, big business will fund, is it ever going to materialize? Or are we just going to head down the same direction indefinitely?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, it usually takes some sort of trauma for a wake-up call, and that's what usually, that's basically how a lot of our government is operated for many years. They always are looking at the last incident that happened and trying to protect it, rather than looking at ahead, which might be down 15, 20 years from now, and allocating the resources. It's always catch up. Yeah. So the vulnerability and the gap may come back to haunt us before something's done.
I guess I would hope to say that we as humanity can avoid that by a little bit of preemptive work. But then again, that's kind of a little bit of my idealism. Huh?
Yeah. Well, it's idealistic, but it's necessary, and things do happen, and there's plenty now. I guess what is different from 10, 15 years ago is that we're able to communicate instantly and perpetually. Through social media and digital media, and so it's there's it doesn't take as much as an effort of letter writing and going to meet with people as it does now to get instant attention to things. So maybe collectively there's more hope.
Well, I think this is the first step in trying to get some awareness out. And I appreciate you joining. If I get them any longer than this, people start not to listen to anything longer than a half hour.
Okay.
So maybe we can talk again. I would love to.
Yeah, I'd love to. That's great.
Yeah, and if we get some more details, I have some more of these scheduled, Chuck, with different experts. And I really want to start building this awareness in this area to try and get some efforts together that we can say this works instead of this is just what some big companies will fund today.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. That's and it can happen. I mean, there's some idealism in me too. So I think I think in this world now that we're in, it's changed a lot. Just even in the last 5 years of how things just sort of stop on a dime and change on a dime. So,
Yeah.
I think there's hope for something for someone with your thinking and my thinking to do something.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining today, and I appreciate it. And hopefully we'll rope you in again here in the future. All right.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
All right. Have a good day, Chuck.
You too. Take care.